Sedana Medical is a Swedish medtech company that became a pharma company only recently. It was founded in 2005 as a medtech company and works with inhaled sedation with its own device called Sedaconda ACD. I'm going to show you a slide with the device in a moment. The headquarters are in Stockholm, and currently there are 85 employees. But as Anna said, 4 years ago there were only 3 persons in the headquarters and 10 salespeople in Europe. So we've grown very rapidly. And this device was the first device that made it possible to give this therapy in the ICU. And now we have a 300-patient randomized controlled trial that's been published, and that was supporting our marketing authorization application that was approved in a decentralized procedure earlier this year. And this is a therapy that now is mentioned in many guidelines in Europe and also in Latin America. So what is this product? So it actually consists of, the therapy consists of 2 different products. One is a drug and the other is a device. And the device, which you see down on the right side there, it's a small modified heat moisture exchanger that's used in ICU patients normally, but with this device you can actually give the drug. And the drug, as I said, was approved only this year, so it's been an off-label therapy since I did my PhD in 2006. The indication that we have is Sedaconda is indicated for sedation of mechanically ventilated adult patients during intensive care. So a very broad indication. And just the medical background then, ICU patients that are mechanically ventilated have a tube down their throat. They have a machine that's breathing for them. This is quite uncomfortable, and for this reason, many patients require something to make them feel more comfortable and to avoid having them pull out the tube. So comfort and safety are the main reasons why we give patients sedation. Sedation is a lighter version of anesthesia, of general anesthesia, you could say. The patient is usually rousable. When you have general anesthesia, the patient doesn't move anything while the surgery is ongoing. But during sedation, most of the time, the patient is only slightly asleep, so to say. The therapeutic landscape before we popped up with inhaled sedation consisted of intravenous sedation, and that works quite well for many patients, but ICU patients are very sick. If you think of a COVID patient lying in the ICU, I don't know if you've seen any images or you've heard about, or if you maybe know someone who's been in the ICU, maybe one of you have been in the ICU. It's really a patient that may have a single organ failure, that is respiratory failure, that leads to mechanical ventilation. But a lot of the time, these patients are experiencing renal dysfunction, hepatic dysfunction. Many of them are old. They may have altered pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics for that reason. So drugs that normally would be short-acting become long-acting. Also, these drugs are given for many days, and that leads to tolerance development and also withdrawal when you end the delivery of these drugs. So none of the drugs in the ICU to date have been kind of the perfect drug. And physicians work with cocktails, they combine different drugs, they do drug rotation. There are all kinds of tricks you can do to try to avoid the side effects of IV drugs. So how about isoflurane, the drug that we now can market? This is a general anesthetic, inhaled anesthetic, that's been used for over 40 years for general anesthesia. And it's considered to be one of the safest drugs for anesthesia. It has several sites of action in the brain and in the spinal cord. It's metabolized to a very low degree. It doesn't really accumulate, and it's not toxic in anesthetic doses. This drug was tested for ICU sedation in about 1/3 of the dose needed for anesthesia. It was tested in the late 80s. A publication in the British Medical Journal demonstrated good sedation efficacy, shorter wake-up times. Patients woke up with better cognitive function than when they received IV sedation. So it all sounded very good. And given the pharmacology of the drug, that it quickly leaves the system through exhalation, explains a lot of that. However, at that time, there was no simple way to give the drug because ICU ventilators don't have a vaporizer on, and you need a vaporizer to make this fluid that you have in a bottle into volatile anesthetic. So this is where the device came in, the Sedaconda ACD, the one I showed you on the previous slide. This was a device that was developed in the late 90s and that made it possible to use the regular ICU ventilator. All you need is a syringe pump and that little device, and then you can give patients this therapy. And the randomized controlled trials that have been performed to date, we did the first one with the device at Karolinska back in 2004, that was published, indicated that you needed less of the other drugs, less opioids, patients woke up faster, everything seemed simply better with this drug. But it was off-label. And in 2006, when I had my PhD defense, one representative from Abbott, that is one of the companies that sold and still sells, I think, isoflurane. I asked him afterwards, so why don't you go for this? Shouldn't you try to have this as an ICU sedative in your portfolio? And he said, no, the things we have to do for this, too expensive. I mean, he said, isoflurane is commercially dead. It's been around for 20 years. There's no kind of patent or anything. So that was that. And it took 10 years until someone decided otherwise. This was just a slide about the pharmacokinetics, the difference between IV and inhaled sedation. So IV goes into the system intravenously, first passage metabolism to the brain, and then when you want to get rid of it, your liver needs to break down the drug and it needs to be eliminated through the kidneys. That's the typical route. Whereas inhaled sedation is only in, and then you remove the delivery and the patient exhales it, and that goes quickly. It passes the biological membranes very quickly. So we're talking about a wake-up that takes maybe an hour compared to several hours or even days with IV sedatives. This is the device. So it's really a device that's very simple and resembles a lot the device that's used today for heating and moisturizing the airways. When you are intubated, you don't moisturize the air that goes to the lungs because it passes through normally air goes through your nose and through your pharynx, and it's 100% saturated and warm. When you put a tube down the windpipe, you bypass that. So you need to find a way to moisturize the air and heat it. And then you use this reflector, a heat moisture exchanger. And this is simply a heat moisture exchanger with a special infusion line through which you infuse the volatile anesthetic, liquid volatile anesthetic, and then it's vaporized when the breath is given from the ventilator, and when the patient exhales, it sticks to an active carbon filter, about 90% sticks, and is reflected with the next breath. So it's quite a clever design, I would say. Sophisticated simplicity was an expression that someone shared just recently. I think that's a good way of describing it. And it sits there right next to the endotracheal tube there, you see. So, and then there's the syringe pump. So it doesn't change things so much for the ICU nurse. You just need to know how to operate the syringe pump. And as I mentioned, the first study was published in 2004. And that was lots of fun doing it. It was very much pioneering, I would say, because this was the first time it was being used in the ICU. I had no idea that it was not CE marked. I didn't know what CE mark was then. They just came from the company and said, would you like to try this? And my supervisor and I said, yeah, that sounds interesting. We read this paper from the 89 from Kong in the UK, and yeah, let's do it. And as you can see here, look at the wake-up times here, the top line, the time to extubation, that's when you remove the tube, from stopping the drug. For isoflurane, 10 minutes. For midazolam, which was then the gold standard sedative, 250 minutes. And look at the variability. So within ±5 versus ±270 minutes. So it was clearly much faster with isoflurane than with midazolam to wake patients up. And also, you could predict when they would wake up, that you'd prepare yourself for extubation. So there was no doubt that this was something that this could bring something to the ICU, having this available. But as I said, at that time, no one was interested to get this drug approved. And so the journey for Sedana, when it comes to going from the device approval to the drug approval, was, as I said, that I think for the company, this publication and later publications from other places led actually the CEO of a former company. When that was bought, he bought out the device with royalties and said, well, let's make this into a company just working with this single product of device. And they did that for many years, and then they decided, let's make this into approved therapy. The study was performed, and it showed that it was non-inferior versus propofol. And then we applied for a marketing authorization application, and with an application, and this was granted this summer. And currently 11 of the 15 countries have approved it on a national level. The device, as you can see, is approved in all those dark blue countries, is approved in many countries, but the drug is only approved in 11 and soon 15 countries in Europe. And this was this kind of full mixed application that we utilized. We'd hoped that they would accept the German competent authority, because in Germany that was where the biggest market was, that they would accept like a well-established use. But they wanted to see one randomized controlled trial. So the steps in more detail, from medtech to pharma, from the Anaconda technology people to bringing inhaled sedation to intensive care. 2015, that was actually, we met, I think, the first time 2014. Then the company, the tiny company that was selling these devices, had sold almost 300,000 devices. And one device is for 24-hour use. So 300,000 treatment days and over 30 publications in the area. I say loads of phase 2 studies, you could say, that indicated this could be beneficial. And it was from our study to other studies in asthma patients, long-term follow-up studies, organ protection studies, cardiac arrest patients, looking at even at survival in surgical patients, indicating that this might be better when it comes to long-term outcomes in patients. So a lot of data. But this was not kind of GCP monitored data completely, and a lot of retrospective studies as well. And so in 2016, that was when the board of directors at Sedana Medical decided, let's make this an approved therapy so we can fully market our device and also drug. And at that time, there was 0 people in Sedana Medical working in the medical department, 0 people working in the regulatory department. It's a bit different now. We have representatives here. So that's when I went to you folks at SDS and said, we need help. And then you invited a few clinicians who knew a little bit in this field. So I was one of them, and some German colleagues as well. And then we approached together the German competent authority to discuss with them. In 2017, there was a study protocol available, and the clinical trial began then, and Sedana Medical also did an IPO to raise the money for this. And then that's when I joined as well in 2017. And that's been quite a journey since then. It took some time to get the patients in, and by July this year, we had the high-level data. High-level data results were last year in July, were presented and showed that this was non-inferior to propofol, which was now the gold standard. And then we submitted the MAA with a lot of work together in November, and then it was approved in July. And the data were published in Lancet Respiratory Medicine in August. This is the publication that was generated from the data, these 300 patients that we had in the study. And this was obviously a team effort with lots of investigators. These were all folks who were like I was 15 years ago. They were using this in their ICU, and they believed in this, so they were very passionate about working on a randomized controlled trial to get this drug that they saw in their daily practice worked, to get it approved. And so it was very rewarding, I would say very, very gratifying to actually have that publication out as a thank you, because Sedana was tiny, and they really did this work almost for nothing, I would say. And so the study, what was the study about? We sedated patients for up to 2 days, up to 48 hours, with either isoflurane or the gold standard propofol. And there were assessments of the efficacy of sedation every 2 hours. That was the primary endpoint. That was what the authorities wanted to see, and they also wanted to see some safety. So we did some safety data collection as well during the study and up to 30 days after the end of the study. And looking at the primary endpoint, you can see these are the point estimates for proportion of time within target level of sedation, which we had defined. And you can see that for propofol, it was 91.9% of the time. That was the point estimate. And for isoflurane, it was 90.7%. And we had a non-inferiority margin, as you have to have when you do a non-inferiority study. And we were well away from that non-inferiority margin with isoflurane. So the line and the bars you see there, that's a 95% confidence interval. We could demonstrate that opioid use was reduced with isoflurane, which was a finding in the previous studies. So that was one of the secondary endpoints, and we could show that this was true without patients really experiencing pain. We measured pain on a pain scale as well, like an observer's scale that is the gold standard for assessing pain in non-communicating patients. And there was no indication that this opioid reduction led to more pain. So that's also something that we have now in our label. And looking at the wake-up times, you remember they were much shorter in the first study we did with the device. They were much shorter compared to a benzodiazepine called midazolam. They were also shorter for isoflurane compared to propofol, which is a more short-acting drug, IV drug, looking at day 2. So the summary was really that we were able to demonstrate non-inferiority with regards to staying in the target range on the sedation scale. Opioid requirements were lower. Patients had more spontaneous breathing. Wake-up times were shorter, and outcomes, long-term outcomes when it comes to time to extubation, delirium-free days, coma-free days, ventilator-free days, and ICU-free days are endpoints that are very common in ICU intervention studies. They're very important outcomes for the ICU patient and for the hospital as well. And looking at the adverse events, there were no serious adverse events related to the use of any of the study drugs. So in total, it was deemed that this was well tolerated, this treatment. Now, this didn't just happen. This sounds so nice, and everything was just, so smooth, and there were no question marks. The truth is that there were a bunch of them, more than I could even imagine before we started. And sometimes it's good that you don't know about what's going to come, because then you still have energy to manage that first problem, and then the second one and the third one. So when I was compiling this, I just listed some of them, and this is not, I'm not giving you a regulatory or statistical that kind of presentation. It's more like from a clinical researcher perspective and diving into this unknown world and all those bumps you have on the way to that Lancet publication and to the approval. And I hope to kind of conclude what I feel was important in all of this. So first of all, when it comes to designing the clinical trial, as I mentioned, we were hoping that we would be able to use a bibliographic application, just using available data. At that time, as I said, there were many studies already. They wanted to have a randomized controlled trial, and they said 300 patients is the minimum, because then you have somehow sufficient amount of safety data for us to approve this. They were very well aware of quite an extensive off-label use in Germany. So I think, and also the data for this drug in anesthesia scenario were very kind of supporting this concept in so many ways. So I think they felt that they wanted to sleep well when they signed, just as the previous speaker said, that people who are in the authority position, they don't want to prove something that turns out to be dangerous or bad for the patient, and that's good. So we had to figure out how should this study be designed, and we looked at a recent precedent that was 2 studies looking at another ICU sedative and the approval in Europe for that. Those were 2 studies called the PRODEX study and the MIDEX study. They were comparing a sedative called dexmedetomidine versus midazolam and versus propofol, so 2 of the other sedatives. And we were inspired by their design, and that also, I think, was comforting for BfArM to see that we had some kind of template that we were following. And we used the same non-inferiority margin that was used in the PRODEX study. That was a 15% relative to the control arm, so to the point estimate for the control arm. But there were some things here. Now, the scale that we used, the Richmond Agitation Sedation Scale, that's how you assess sedation efficacy. I don't know how well you see, but it goes from patients being almost in anesthesia, unrousable, so you could perform surgery in a patient that's -5, nothing would happen, to combative, which is +4 on the scale. So that's wide awake and aggressive, pulling things and trying to hit the nurse or something. So obviously we don't want to be on the plus side. Looking at the PRODEX and the MIDEX study, dexmedetomidine is a different drug. It has a different profile. It's good for light sedation, but it's not very good for slightly deeper sedation. And so you need to figure out what does your drug do? What's it good for? What patients, of course, but also what do you want to treat? How do you want to treat them? What do you want to achieve? And we decided that we should change our success target from what was 0 to -3 in the product and MIDEX studies as considered to be successful sedation. For us, it was -1 to -4. With isoflurane, you end up often with slightly deeper sedation, but without any problems in waking the patient up. So we felt that we could actually do that shift. But that had consequences then. So, as I said, it should be -1 to -4 for isoflurane and propofol. -1 to -4 was the appropriate interval. And that meant that we couldn't directly translate the variance from the Prodex and the MIDEX studies, because there was a variance in those studies, to our study when making a power sample size calculation. And we looked at other studies. They all used their own definition of target sedation. We used one with Bloomsbury sedation scale, and we had like one level only when we did the study in 2004. So there was kind of no other study that had used this very this very interval. So we didn't know what would be the success proportion and what would be the variance. We made some guesses there. And so we decided then that with the unknown variance in these two groups, we could maybe use a blinded sample size re-estimation. I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with that, but it's really about making a guess of what the variance might be, like the worst case scenario. So that was 40% standard deviation, and then that would mean that we'd need 550 patients to demonstrate non-inferiority with sufficient power. But with the possibility to do sample size re-estimation, this meant that we could actually, at some stage throughout the study, when we had sufficient number of patients, we could have an assessment of the variance. We could look at the variance isolated in a blinded fashion. So not looking at the proportion of success between groups, but simply looking at the variance. And the statistician would be blinded then. And that would allow us then to make a new sample size that we could go after, and hopefully it would be less than 550. And doing this means that there's a risk of a type 1 error, and this was something that we consulted BfArM about doing, and they said, well, if you do it, you need to be aware of that there's a risk of inflation here. You need to take that into account. So throughout the study, we had this as in our statistical analysis plan, that we do sample size re-estimation, and it was very, very exciting, or it was like a thriller, I could say, before we did it, because we were including, and we weren't really including in patients in the pace we'd hoped for. 550 patients in this type of study is really a lot. If you look into studies in interventions in ICU, typically you have about 10% of the denominator of the patients eligible that end up being randomized. So 550 means you need to actually have screen 5,000 patients, and that's quite a lot. And so when we did the sample size re-estimation, we were really hoping that it would show us a low variance. And there was a lot of work, of course, to do this. But the benefit, as I mentioned, was that we might be able to reduce the number of patients. And when we did do this blinded sample size re-estimation, that was the case as well. It showed we didn't get the variance number, because that was part of the setup, was that the data would be looked at and it would be cleaned, and or any indicators of what treatment the patient would get would be removed, and then everything would go into a box, and someone was sitting somewhere in a secret room, and we were not supposed to speak to them. And then comes this encrypted email. I'm sitting at a meeting, and like, code here, it says sample size 300. So it's like champagne time. So I think we were, well, lucky, but at the same time, I think we anticipated that the variance would be lower. But we didn't know whether it would come down to 300 or if it would be 400. And obviously that was helpful, that we only needed 300. And that's something that I think you need to have people to give you this advice, people who know that. So thanks for that. So Toy Boy is very happy for that. There were some other things that it says events here with 1E should be that I wanted to share with you, things that happened that also that we all were able to kind of resolve thanks to good teamwork, because that's really what this is about. It's about teamwork. One is about a different device size that we used in our trial, and the other one is issues with informed consent, and the third one is adding follow-up during the course of the study. So, addition of a smaller device. The device that they showed us at the hospital when I was working as a young resident in 2001 was the one you see on the left. That's a non-CE mark device. We started off our study with that. During the study, they came with this device in the middle. This was a more fancy one, the one that was commercially marketed later on after the study was finished. It was really basically the same thing, just a bit different shape. In 2017, when the clinical trial, just about when the clinical trial started, a new smaller device was introduced. And this smaller device was better in that it didn't have as much what's called dead space, didn't have as much space where the air just goes back and forth and isn't really exchanged. When you have a lot of so-called dead space, you can end up with rebreathing. So carbon dioxide levels can rise. It's like breathing through a long pipe. Or when you're snorkeling, it shouldn't be too long because you're not getting any new air. It's all the same air just going up and down. And this improvement was something we were discussing a lot internally. Should we or should we not now amend the protocol? Should we add this device? Should we allow people to use it? The first months when it was marketed, we were happy that it wasn't in because we felt no one really knows how. We think it's going to work well, but there could be problems. But then after a few months, we felt more and more confident that this is actually what we're going to be seeing used almost exclusively, because that benefit didn't come with any real downsides, because the reflection capacity was basically the same. The drug dosing seemed to be pretty much the same. So we decided, yes, we should include it. At the same time, that could potentially be a risk to introduce it. And so we went to BfArM to ask them, would you accept us including this in the study? And actually they said that you could do that, but then you need to think about that it's a different device, and we'd like to see some data on potential differences. And from a clinical perspective, we had enough experience. I mean, we trusted our engineers and we trusted the clinical information we were getting in those first months of it being marketed. And so thanks to that advice, we felt, let's do it. So we did include the small device in that study, even though it was almost halfway through the study. And then we had some criteria for when you use the big one and when you use the small one. And a lot thanks to the fact that we did that we did have those discussions internally, that we did discuss with BfArM. We didn't just go for the conservative approach. We've got the big one, let's stick to the big one. Let's not mix in anything new here. These discussions in the team and also with the authorities led to that we actually benefited from this, because when we went for our label, we didn't have to say it has to be the big one or the small one. We could argue about that. It depends on how much the patient's breathing, what is their ventilation status, because if you already have high CO2 levels, even if your tidal volume, your breaths are big enough, you maybe shouldn't have the big one. So we kind of uncoupled the device-drug combination to be fixed to one size, and so that's something that the clinician has to decide. Dosing didn't seem to be very different, but we did all those analyses that BfArM asked us for. And today I'm very happy we did that, because another aspect of this is we just had our IND submitted yesterday, and with the FDA, the interaction we had with them, there we're only going to use the small device. And we had discussions with them about the German study. Can we use the data for our safety database? And initially they were, no, you can't use, you had the big one and the small one. You can use the ones from the small one. And then we were able to tell them, no, there's no big difference between the small and the big one. And we even have data in our study to show that. And they accepted that. And we only had the big device, that we probably couldn't use those data because we're going with a completely different device. And that was an unexpected kind of benefit that we didn't think about then. Now we come to sensitive topic: informed consent. This was also a challenge for us in our clinical trial. As you can imagine, a sedation study in the ICU, patients need to be intubated to be eligible for a study like that. Now, how many patients do you imagine can actually themselves give consent if they're intubated when it's time to include them in a study? Very few. So you have some patients that have surgery, major surgery, and it's known that after surgery they'll go to the ICU for mechanical ventilation for 12 hours or for a day. But most patients in the ICU come there because they're critically ill or because they've had an accident. So you don't have that opportunity to discuss with them. And in Sweden, it's really difficult to do research in those patients, because interventional research, because you need to have a legally authorized representative, a god man, and I think you know that doesn't happen overnight. In Sweden, there's no good system for that, and that's been quite heavily criticized, that really we can't be part of developing therapies for these patients. That are kind of emergency patients. In Germany, they've solved this with the German drug law. The German drug law is quite complicated. However, it does describe a way of including emergency patients, in clinical trials. That's really it's like a cascade. You need to ask yourself, can this patient consent? No, cannot consent. Okay. Is there a legally authorized representative who can consent? Okay, yes, there is. But that has to be someone who is pretty much like in Sweden. There needs to be a kind of a court decision that this is the legally authorized representative. That can sometimes happen overnight, sometimes the same day, depending on the court. Some courts, however, believe that this law, and laws, when I was young, I thought that in the law, if you read the book, you can find everything there and you know exactly how it's going to work. And now I realize that lawyers are there because you don't. You need lawyers because they interpret what's written there, and it can be interpreted in different ways. And the same goes for the German drug law. So some courts in Germany, they believe that the German drug law stipulates this only for patients that are permanently incapacitated. So say you have a serious accident and now you can't speak and your cognitive function is really low, then they should be doing this. So those courts, they don't even care about an application. I have an emergent patient who's in the ICU. We want to bring him into a study. They're like, listen, we'll look at this in 3 weeks. So they're like in Sweden. So among legal folks in Germany, there are different ways of seeing this law. Is this law applicable for the emergency patient here and now who might recover in 3 days? Yes, some courts say it is. We'll look at all these studies you have. We'll do it. We'll do an on-call thing. In hospitals like that, you can actually run these kind of trials. Other hospitals that don't see it this way, that say this is only for patients who have a syndrome and who have a legally authorized representative because of that, who have had a serious accident or had a stroke or something. And the same goes for physicians. So the way physicians see this in Germany has also been very variable. In this clinical study that was drafted, we had a German CRO, and the mistake we did, I would say, was that we believed that they knew something about critical care, but they didn't know much. So they helped write that section of the protocol. I was not working at Sedana then. I was just a medical consultant. So I'm putting the blame all on them. No, but seriously, what they wrote there was they wrote that the German drug law permits emergency inclusion, but there was no specification of exactly how do you do this. These are the steps you need to take. This is the checklist. It was more like the German drug law does permit inclusion of emergency patients and so on. And this led to that some physicians didn't document every step in this cascade. And this led to just a few months after I started Sedana, the trial was running then already. We had inspections in a few sites, and the inspector said, "This is wrong. This is against GCP. This is you've included patients against their will or without knowing what they want." And so that was quite challenging, obviously. And as I mentioned, what happened was that these physicians, if you're in the ICU, you work there for all your life. Patients intubated, and you know they can't, they're intubated, you know they can't. You ask as a legal authorized representative, and if there is, or if there's not, documenting it doesn't change anything. So they didn't care about documenting. So what they did was they decided this is an emergency patient. This is a patient, there's no legally authorized representative, there's no possibility for the patient to give consent. The third step in the cascade is this an emergency condition? And you could say the fourth step is the treatment life-saving? Can it reduce morbidity or reduce suffering? If so, yes, you can go ahead. But then you need to write that. and they hadn't written it. They just assumed that this is known. One of the studies before our study indicated that isoflurane could potentially reduce mortality. And the studies obviously that indicate that it can reduce suffering, by giving good sedation to patients. And there are also numbers of studies that indicate that it is organ protective. So you could say that very many of these criteria would be fulfilled, but they didn't document this, and also the inspector was not an intensivist, so she didn't know, and she didn't know whether to see this as an emergency situation. Patients on a drug already, on a sedative already. So why do we need to? What's the drama? This is no emergency. Everything's quiet. So how do we solve this? Did we creep back into our hole at Sedana and stop the study? No, we didn't actually, but we could have. It was quite difficult because we had to stop all emergency inclusions, and there was a press release about this, and the share price both down. It was just a major catastrophe. What we did was, and this is also about teamwork, I would say, we teamed up with a very, very good German lawyer, not the kind of aggressive type, but more someone who listens and who reads, and he has a PhD in the German drug law. A very good person. We traveled to the inspector actually, and that was against the advice from our CRO. You should just do this by paper. We met the inspector face to face in Oldenburg. We discussed what had happened. How did this happen? We described the patient category. We described the situation. I could share a little bit about the data behind the isoflurane being a potentially life-saving drug, potentially morbidity reducing. And Oliver, the lawyer, Oliver Stöckel, spoke to her about, there's this. If you read this literature, it says that you could see this as applicable maybe for those who are permanently incapacitated, or you could see it as emergency patients that are here and now. And there seems to be that no doctor has done this. We haven't tried to cheat anyone, because she really thought that she had found this was a scoop, that this is a company that was trying to do something really, really bad. And also, she went to Oldenburg, and I don't know if you know about Oldenburg, but that's where there was a German nurse who was sentenced to, I think, lifetime imprisonment for killing like 100 patients. And he worked in Oldenburg in this very ICU, so it was a bit unfortunate for us, I would say. But I think with joint forces, after discussing with her, what happened was that after a few weeks, and we revised our protocol, we made an amendment, we put in a checklist where you had to document everything. We had retraining for the CRO, we retrained the physicians as well to understand that this is how you need to do it. You need to write. The patient cannot speak. It's obvious, but you write it so the inspector, who's never been in the ICU before, can see that I've actually looked at these different steps. And she went as far as she spoke to all the inspectors in Germany, and she offered to write a paper on this with a lawyer about how you could see the German drug law. So from being our enemy and from almost killing off this study, she became our best friend. And we were able to actually resume these emergency inclusions. And it was really a misunderstanding, even though I'd say the drug law isn't written in a way that makes it very easy. It's quite difficult to interpret it. So that was quite a drama, but I think it's relevant to mention. I think it's an interesting story how you can actually, by speaking to people, not being afraid to discuss with people, if you have good intentions and you do your homework, you can actually find common ground. And then the 30-day follow-up that we added, I'd like to mention. So we didn't. This was also quite complicated. How long time should you follow up a patient that gets a treatment in the ICU for 2 days? Initially, the protocol stipulated 30 days. You record all adverse events. 2 patients were included in the principal investigators, and then it was deemed impossible. And this was also before I started Sedana. So initially, there was a 30-day follow-up planned, but in the ICU, patients have adverse events every day. I think if you were to document every adverse event, you'll probably have like several every day, because they are critically ill. So they will have hyperkalemia, hyponatremia, fluid overload, hypotension, arrhythmia, respiratory insufficiency, hypoxia. There's so many things happening all the time. So to follow a patient like that and look at all the adverse events for 30 days, maybe you could include like a few patients in a trial, and then you wouldn't have any people wanting to recruit any more patients. So that was removed. But then we realized that, but this is when I started, I realized that we're not doing anything any longer. We were going to do everything too much for 30 days. Now we're not doing anything. So then we said we need to have these data. We need to know how long were they on the ventilator, how long were they in the ICU, because in all ICU studies with interventions, those are like classical endpoints, longer term outcomes, 30-day outcomes. And then we'd come through we were almost, I think 30% of the patients had been recruited. So should we do this? I mean, this is going to be incomplete. The data will be incomplete. Maybe let's just skip it and let's just do a short-term study. We just want an approval. So what would you do? Well, we went the hard way again. We said, yes, we have to do this follow-up, even though it will be incomplete. It will be worth something. And actually, it was worth very much. It turned out to be worth extremely much, actually, because what happened was we met inspectors, we met the competent authorities before we submitted, and there was a lot of questions about how long can you use this. We did a study with only 48-hour exposures, and in the 30-day follow-up, we didn't only look at ventilator time, ICU stay, mortality, need for renal replacement therapy. We also asked the question every day, what sedative is your patient on? And the information was very valuable, because in the end of the day, when we were asked, we wanted a broad indication. We didn't want a time limit. We knew that people were using this for weeks in the ICU, and there were a few previous studies that used this for weeks as well. And even the mortality study that indicated reduced mortality, that was patients that had received this for 4 days or longer. And so having a 48-hour restriction, I mean, wouldn't be very good for us in so many ways. And when we got questions about long-term exposure, we could actually pull out those data from those 30-day data and say that, okay, 44 out of 120 patients that we have long-term follow-up in were treated for more than 48 hours. And out of those, 10 of them were treated for more than a week. And looking at the long-term outcomes, they were not worse. Numerically, they were better for the isoflurane group. And this, together with the previous data, the literature data, led to the approval of the label without a time restriction. And so that wouldn't have happened, I think, if we hadn't collected those data. So they're incomplete, but they're worth something. So I'd never say no to some at least reasonable data collection, even if you don't have a complete data set. Now, some regulatory activities after the trial and during submission worth note. So we were a big team in the end, and when it was time to submit, we were no longer just one person in the medical department and 0 in the regulatory. We were very many more, but we still need a lot of help and support. So SDS helped us a lot with project management, non-clinical, good statisticians, regulatory strategy, CMC, etc. We had our own regulatory folks on board then, clinical experts from the study, I mean PIs, clinicians who'd used this a lot. So I wasn't the only one. There were the German physicians as well, and also external resources. So we didn't only have SDS, we also had someone from NDA, a safety physician who was really good and could help us formulate responses, because it's not something you can't learn at school. You need a lot of mileage and to be part of these processes, to understand what is the language we should be using, and what are their fears. That's one of the things. What are the regulators? What are they afraid of? They're afraid. They want to feel comfortable. They want to feel okay when they give an approval. They want to feel okay when they say okay to an unrestricted duration of treatment, etc., etc. And so that really, I think, made it, having that team. And also, we went to other authorities. This was a decentralized procedure. So you have, like, I don't know how many of you are familiar with it, but you have like a reference member state, and then you have the other reference state and other member states. And we went to two of the others. BfArM was the reference state, and we went to the MPA in Sweden, and we went to the MHRA, and they helped us, you could say, because they accepted to meet us, and we asked some questions. Some of them were really important. Some were just kind of phony questions, so we have reason to be there. And so no, I'm just saying the truth. But then we got a chance to discuss things that we thought might be sensitive. So one of the things was full mixed application. Okay, that's everyone said that's fine. We got some good advice about single pivotal study, which is what we were going with. We had our single pivotal study, and there's a publication about that, and there's guidance, and we were able to understand better what we need to include in our submission. So I think that helped us a lot. And also they discussed presenting data for subgroups, looking at, we ended up actually splitting the data, looking at old, looking at young, looking at sicker patients and more healthy patients, etc., men and women. And also we got input on our non-clinical dossier. We didn't do any new tox studies. We just relied on old ones, and none of the authorities in Europe wanted to see any tox studies, neither the German one, MPA, or MHRA. And I think we felt, having met a few of these, we got kind of a good feeling that what we should be doing. In MHRA, they were asking us about opioids that we used in our study. There are different ones you can use in different countries, so we were able to already preemptively address that in our dossier. They also want us to stratify analysis, some of the analysis for different subgroups. They want us to discuss the device, this adjustment for potential inflation due to sample size re-estimation. Jonas Nilsson at SDS did a really fancy various kinds of plots to show that it didn't really matter that we did it when we did it. And also they said you don't need any animal studies. And so when we came to the time for submission, we felt that we were quite well prepared, and we had a good big team that discussed a lot together internally. So what do we do? What do we do with this result? What do we do with that result? I mean, we had a really tight timeline, and results were just dropping in until like just a few weeks before submission, because there was so much data to analyze. And as I said, they need to feel comfortable, the authorities, and I think they did in the long run feel comfortable with what we supplied them with, and when we responded also to all the questions. And in a way, it's not, I'm sure many of you have sent in a scientific paper, so it's quite similar that reviewers, you hate them when they send in their stuff to you and they want you to answer all kinds of questions. But then when you start thinking and you're done, you feel like, actually, this wasn't too bad. This actually became quite good. And as I said, that led to this approval in July 2021. So inhaled sedation with Sedaconda is here. So I think that's fantastic. I mean, for me, in 2006, I had never imagined that I'd be standing here talking about that it's actually approved, which I think I think this is good for patients, actually. And so take-home messages are really that seek regulatory advice and be open for discussion. I think that's a good thing to think about. I mean, that one shouldn't be afraid to interact with authorities in general. I mean, I spoke about the inspectors. So any authorities, I think, these are human beings, and most of them are not here to make our life difficult. They're here to make sure that we do things right and that patients stay safe. And try to understand their points, their position. Why are they saying what they're saying? And by meeting them also, it's easier to get a buy-in when you come further in the process, because they've been part of the process. And then, of course, I've learned, I would say, that one shouldn't overpromise at meetings. One should just listen and say, okay, and then you go home and you think together. Another one is to identify good regulatory partners. I mean, people who have good strategic thinking, good statisticians, people who have worked in agencies are really good people to have on board as well, because they know how they think as well. And then also I would say not to be afraid to go with different people, that pick the good people from different places. They don't all have to come from one place, because it's often that one workplace may have somebody very strong on one thing, but not maybe someone who's strong in the other area. And finally, just working as a team, that when you discuss across professions and with people with varying experiences, it's a very fruitful atmosphere, and so it makes it fun as well. And with that, I end, and there 1 minute left for questions.